September 11th, 1945, San Francisco Bay. The military transport ship groaned against the dock, its hull scraping wood and metal in a sound that echoed across the water like something dying. Below deck, in the medical hold where the air hung thick with iodine and morphine, Yoko Tanaka stared at the ceiling. She couldn't move, not by choice. Her body had forgotten how. The rivets above her head numbered 43. She had counted them 1,000 times during the voyage from Manila, each count a small victory against the void. Her hands gripped the cot's edges, knuckles bone white, the only part of her she could still command with certainty. From the waist down, nothing. No sensation, no movement. Just a terrible absence where her legs used to exist. If this story moves you, show it hit like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to remember that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion can survive. Because what happened next would challenge everything Yoko had been taught about enemies, about war, about the very nature of civilization itself. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with weapons. Through the porthole near her cot, she glimpsed America, buildings that pierced clouds, cars lined up like children's toys, the Golden Gate Bridge rising in the distance, its towers catching September light like something from a dream. She had been taught that Americans were devils, monsters wearing human skin, men who would finish what her own countrymen had started in that Philippine jungle camp 3 months ago, the beating that shattered her spine, the punishment for trying to escape, the moment everything ended. She closed her eyes as footsteps approached. American voices, English words she barely understood. She braced herself for the hatred she had been promised, for the revenge that would be their right. The medic's voice cut through her fear like a blade through silk. "We're going to take care of you now," he said through a translator. "You're safe." In that moment, lying on a cot in the belly of a ship in San Francisco Bay, Yoko Tanaka realized that everything she had been taught was a lie. And that realization was more terrifying than any beating, more disorienting than paralysis itself. Because if the enemy could show kindness, then what did that make her? What did that make everyone who had believed? What did that make the war? The propaganda had been beautiful in its simplicity. Americans were beasts, less than human, creatures without souls or mercy. Yoko had grown up breathing these images like air. Posters showing American soldiers with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts describing their savagery in voices that never wavered. Teachers explaining with academic precision that Western devils understood only violence, only domination, only cruelty. She had believed it all. Why wouldn't she? She was 20 when the war began, a nursing student in Osaka, learning her craft in quiet hospital corridors where the future seemed predictable and safe. The war had seemed distant at first, something happening in China, something soldiers discussed in low voices, something that didn't concern young women studying anatomy and wound care. Then Pearl Harbor. Then the declarations that changed everything. Then the mobilization that swallowed the nation whole. Then the draft notices that came for everyone, even for young women who had only wanted to heal. The Japanese Imperial Army Medical Corps took her in 1942. She was 21 years old. They gave her a uniform, a rank, and orders she couldn't refuse. She would serve at a military hospital in Manila, treating wounded soldiers as the empire expanded across the Pacific like a tide that seemed unstoppable. She had no choice in the matter. None of them did. You served or you disappeared. Those were the only options in Imperial Japan during the war years, and questioning wasn't courage, it was suicide. Manila had been different than she expected. The hospital was large, surprisingly well-equipped, brutally functional. The wounded came in waves that never stopped. They were boys 17, 18, 19 missing limbs, faces burned, screaming through nights morphine could no longer soften. Supplies were gone. Bandages were reused until they disintegrated. Yoko learned to work without sleep, moving from one dying patient to the next, because there was always another boy calling for his mother. By 1945, everything was collapsing. American planes ruled the sky. Artillery grew louder. Medicine and food disappeared. Officers avoided eye contact. The empire was dying, even if no one said it. Yoko didn't know the numbers, America's overwhelming production, the factories, the oil, the steel, but she felt the truth in empty supply rooms and endless wounded pouring in. When Manila fell in February 1945, chaos surged. The hospital was overrun not by Americans, but by shattered Japanese soldiers retreating through ruins. Cut off from command, starving, half-mad, they called themselves the Defenders of Honor. In reality, they were broken men searching for someone to blame. Yoko and 7 other nurses were captured and accused of treason, of treating American prisoners too gently, of honoring the oath to heal rather than harm. She had bandaged wounds, offered water, eased suffering. For compassion, they branded her a traitor, and for that she would pay. The camp they built was barely a camp at all, just a clearing in the Philippine jungle, surrounded by bamboo and barbed wire, an endless green that seemed to swallow light and hope in equal measure. The air was thick enough to drown in. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds that covered exposed skin like living blankets. The rain came every afternoon, turning the ground to mud that sucked at their feet and never dried, and everything smelled of rot and decay, and the jungle slowly consuming itself. They were given 1 meal a day, rice when there was rice, weevils and all, sometimes just water with a few grains floating in it, a mockery of soup that insulted the body even as it tried to sustain it. Yoko watched women she had worked beside for 3 years begin to waste away, their cheeks hollowing, their eyes growing too large for their faces, their bodies consuming themselves for fuel, burning muscle and memory and the strength to believe tomorrow would be different. And the beatings came without warning, without reason, without end, for looking at a guard wrong, for speaking without permission, for being too slow, too loud, too quiet, too anything. The guards used bamboo rods, rifle butts, their fists, their boots. They beat the nurses the way you would beat an animal, with the casual cruelty of men who no longer saw human beings in front of them, only vessels for their own pain and rage, and the unbearable knowledge of defeat. Yoko tried to escape once, just once. It was July, 3 months into their captivity. 3 months of watching her friends die. 3 months of starvation and fear, and the slow realization that no one was coming to save them, that they had been forgotten by the world, that history had moved on and left them behind in this green hell, where death came slowly and mercy was a word from another life. She and 2 other nurses slipped away in the night. They crawled through mud and underbrush, moving inch by inch toward what they hoped were American lines. They could hear artillery in the distance, see flares lighting up the sky like dying stars, Freedom was close. So close they could taste it on the night air, sweet as water, bright as dawn. They were caught before sunrise, dragged back to camp by men whose faces had gone empty. The other 2 nurses were executed immediately, bayoneted in front of everyone as a warning. Their screams ended fast. Their bodies stayed in the mud. Yoko was brought before Sergeant Nakamura Thin as a skeleton, uniform hanging loose, eyes dead. A man hollowed out by cruelty. "You will learn," he said. Then the beating began. They used a wooden beam, thick and heavy. The first blow dropped her. The second struck her lower back. Something inside gave way. The third hit the same spot, and she heard the crack, felt the severing of will from movement. She knew she would never walk again. The rest of the blows blurred into pain and darkness. When she woke in the mud, time had lost meaning. Other prisoners had carried her to their shelter, but there was no help to offer, no medicine, no bandages, only prayers. Yoko tried to move her legs. "Nothing. I can't feel them," she whispered to Yuki, her closest friend. Neither spoke of what paralysis meant in a jungle camp. It was a slow death sentence. She survived 3 months like that, immobile, soaked by rain, wasting away. Bed sores rotted to bone. Fevered dreams replaced waking thought. Her legs withered to sticks. She clung to memories of Osaka in spring, a world that no longer existed. Yuki died in early September, worn down by starvation and dysentery. Yoko couldn't cry. She was beyond grief, surviving only by habit. 3 days later, American soldiers arrived, not prisoners, but a real force. The rogue unit resisted for seconds before being destroyed. Gunfire snapped through the clearing, then silence. The guards were dead or vanished, and the Americans moved through the camp, staring at the survivors with horror, rage, and a kind of shame for having come too late. An American medic knelt beside Yoko. He was young, maybe 22, freckles across his nose, dirt under his fingernails. He looked at her, and his face went pale. "Jesus Christ," he said, and his voice cracked. Then he called for a stretcher, shouting in English words that sounded urgent and angry and determined. They carried her out of that jungle, out of the green hill that had been her prison for 3 months. They loaded her onto a truck, then a plane, then a ship. She barely remembered any of it. The journey blurred together into a fevered dream of movement and voices and the slow dawning realization that she was going to live, that they were saving her, that the monsters had turned out to be saviors and the saviors had turned out to be monsters, and nothing made sense anymore. The voyage to San Francisco took 3 weeks. Yoko spent it in the medical hold, surrounded by wounded American soldiers, men who had fought against her country, men who had every reason to hate her. But when they looked at her, she saw only pity, sometimes anger at what had been done to her, but never hatred for her personally, never the cruelty she had been promised. One soldier, a young man missing his left arm, had given her a small nod as she was wheeled past his cot, a gesture of recognition. One broken person to another, one victim of war acknowledging another. It had almost made her cry, almost broken through the numbness that had kept her alive. The ship was docked now. America waited outside her porthole, real, immediate, nothing like the propaganda. Yoko braced herself to learn whether mercy existed, or if it was simply another mask for cruelty. Letterman General Hospital rose against the San Francisco sky like a monument to order, white, clean, enormous. She had never seen a building so vast, devoted to healing. In Japan, hospitals were modest. This felt like a temple to the belief that broken things could be repaired. They wheeled her through endless white corridors filled with nurses who moved with efficient, non-cruel precision. The antiseptic smell was so intense it almost felt violent after months of filth. She passed rooms of wounded soldiers, boys with bandaged heads, men learning to walk on prosthetics, burned victims tended by gentle hands. Some couldn't look at her. One glared with hatred. She understood. Others nodded, small acknowledgments that pain blurred the lines between enemies. Her private room stunned her, a real bed, clean sheets, a window overlooking flowers. Color felt like a memory returning. Mary, a young nurse with kind eyes, lifted her gently and whispered in halting Japanese, "You're safe now." Yoko wanted to believe her, but trust felt foreign, lost somewhere in the jungle. Dr. William Harrison arrived with Suki, a Japanese-American translator whose existence alone startled her. His touch was calm, professional, watching every flicker of pain. Below her ribs she felt nothing. "I haven't felt my legs since the beating," she whispered. Something hardened in his eyes, anger for her, not at her. "We'll do everything we can," he said. Tests followed. X-rays mapping damage, blood work confirming starvation. She was alive only through stubbornness and the body's refusal to quit. In a wood-paneled conference room, 12 doctors debated her fate. She might not survive anesthesia, warned Dr. Mercer, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke in the careful language of risk assessment. Her body is too weak. The surgery itself could kill her. But if we don't try, argued Dr. Phillips, younger, more passionate, we condemn her to a lifetime in a wheelchair. If she survives at all, Harrison finally spoke, his voice cutting through the debate like a scalpel through tissue. "She's an enemy prisoner, but she's also human. If we can help, we must. That's what separates us from what was done to her. That's what this country is supposed to mean." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the doctors nodded. They would operate. They would try. They would risk her life to save it, because the alternative was accepting that some damage was permanent, that some cruelty couldn't be answered with compassion, that mercy had limits. And America in 1945, bloodied but victorious, couldn't afford to believe that. In the days before surgery, Yoko regained strength through careful meals and blood transfusions. Nurses brushed her hair and turned her gently to prevent new bed sores. Mary read to her in English, the words incomprehensible, but the rhythm soothing. A lullaby in a foreign language that somehow meant safety. Dr. Harrison explained the risks with quiet honesty. The surgery was experimental. The damage was severe. She might die on the table. She might wake up unchanged. She might wake up worse. But doing nothing guaranteed a future without walking, without independence, without the dignity of standing on her own feet. She accepted the risks without hesitation. "Even if it kills me," she said through Suki, "at least you tried. That's more than my own country did." The night before surgery, city lights glittered beyond her window like earthbound stars. "Are you afraid?" Mary asked, sitting beside her bed in the darkness. "Yes," Yoko admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of surviving and never walking again. I'm afraid of carrying this prison in my body for the rest of my life." The operation began before dawn and lasted 19 hours. In the operating theater, Harrison and his team worked with the concentration of men defusing a bomb. Every movement precise, every decision critical. Her spine was worse than expected. Bone fragments embedded in tissue. Nerve damage that might be permanent. Scar tissue that had calcified around the injury like the body trying to seal away the trauma. They cleaned the debris, stabilized the vertebrae, reconstructed what violence had destroyed. In the 12th hour, something happened. A nurse gasped. Yoko's toe had moved, not consciously, not in response to commands, but moved, a twitch, a flicker of connection between brain and body, a sign that the pathway wasn't completely severed, that signals could still travel down the restored architecture of her spine. Harrison looked up from his work, his eyes meeting his team's gazes over their masks. Hope flickered in the operating theater like a candle in the dark. When Yoko woke, the world was white and blinding. Dr. Harrison stood beside her, exhausted but hopeful. "Try to move your toes," he said through Suki. She focused and her right toe twitched. It was small, but enough to make her weep for the first time since Yuki's death, not from grief, but from the shock of feeling restored. Recovery took 8 brutal months. Therapy that felt like torture, muscles relearning purpose, standing, collapsing, rising again. Mary was there daily, celebrating every small victory. Dr. Harrison visited weekly, watching her progress from wheelchair to walker to cane to nothing, until she finally stood on her own. Other patients watched with mixed feelings, admiration, confusion, but mostly understanding. Pain had no nationality. In the ward of the wounded, compassion mattered more than uniforms. 8 months after surgery, Yoko walked the corridor unassisted, each step a miracle of repaired nerves and stubborn will. At the end, Dr. Harrison shook her hand. "You did this," he said. "You fought for it." After the war, Yoko returned to Japan carrying one truth: mercy heals what hatred breaks. She opened a small clinic in Osaka, treating everyone regardless of past or politics. She taught young nurses about Mary, Dr. Harrison, and the Americans who had shown her more kindness as a prisoner than her own nation had shown its citizens. Some called her a traitor. Most simply came to be healed. For the rest of her life, Yoko proved that healing wasn't weakness and kindness wasn't betrayal. The peace, she believed, had been won not by bombs or factories, but by the radical act of treating enemies as human. Yoko died in 1989 at 68, still walking on legs reclaimed through mercy and medicine, still grateful for the miracle of movement, and for the day she learned the enemy was never people, but hatred itself.